I had lived in Georgia for my entire life, surrounded by my parents and the familiar streets where I had grown up. Our house had been a place of comfort, filled with memories that spanned over the years. My father worked for a large company, and although he had always been content with his job, things took an unexpected turn one Friday evening during dinner. We were gathered around the table, enjoying a quiet meal, when he dropped the bombshell. "My company offered me a great opportunity," he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of excitement. "They want me to take on a managerial role in Florida, in a place called Tampa. If I accept, we'd be moving there as a family. The company is even offering to pay for the move and help us find a new house." Mom and I were both taken aback. Florida? It seemed so far away, so different. Dad continued, explaining that it was a big decision, but he felt it might be a fresh start for us, especially since we hadn't taken a family vacation in ages. Tampa sounded like an ideal place for a change of scenery, with its beaches and warm weather. After a long pause, Mom and I exchanged a glance and nodded in agreement. We decided it was worth considering. "How much time do you have to decide?" Mom asked, breaking the silence. Dad glanced at his watch, looking thoughtful. "They've given me 2 weeks," he said. "But if we agree, they'll give us as much time as we need to settle into a new home." That evening, after some discussion, we agreed to start planning for a move. It wasn't going to be easy, but it felt like the right decision at the time. Over the next few weeks, Dad became more and more invested in the idea of moving, and we all began to realize that it wasn't just about the job. It was about the new chapter in our lives. A couple of days later, Mom and Dad booked a trip to Tampa to start house hunting. They spent weekends there, returning on Mondays with updates about the properties they had visited. I stayed behind, going to school and trying to absorb everything happening around me. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, they found the perfect house. I was invited to come along for a second look to see what I thought. It had everything we needed: 4 bedrooms, a spacious living area, a double garage, and a backyard that was just big enough for us to enjoy. It wasn't the biggest house, but it felt like a perfect fit. The inside was modern and well kept, with a large kitchen that instantly caught Mom's attention. She was an amazing cook, and the thought of having more space to prepare her incredible meals made her very excited. I couldn't deny that the house had potential. After a bit of negotiation, Dad made the purchase. Once the house was secured, things started moving quickly. We had to sell our old house, which was bittersweet. It held years of memories, and the thought of leaving it behind made me feel strange. But life was pushing us forward. We went through everything we owned, tossing out old junk and donating anything we didn't need. It was harder than I expected to part with some things, but we were determined not to burden the new house with unnecessary stuff. When it came to packing, Dad was ruthless, much to my surprise. He got rid of 10 boxes of things, while Mom only had 3. As for me, I ended up with 15 boxes, much of it things I hadn't even looked at in years. The hardest part was letting go of my old childhood toys and trinkets, but in the end, I knew it was time to move on. We sold the house in record time, and within 6 weeks, we found ourselves in Tampa, surrounded by boxes and take-out food. We didn't have time to cook yet, so we lived on frozen dinners and fast food. It wasn't glamorous, but it was part of the process. Slowly, we began unpacking and setting up our new home. During this transition, I found a job working remotely, which was a relief. The flexibility of working from home suited me much better than my old office job back in Georgia. I could take breaks, enjoy the hot tub in the backyard, and even get some swimming in during the day. It felt like a luxury, and I soon grew accustomed to the pace of life in Florida. Our new neighborhood had 2 houses nearby. One was empty, with a for sale sign out front. The other was lived in, but the owner, a man in his late 40s or early 50s, never really interacted with us. I'd seen him drive in and out of the driveway a few times, but he never waved back when I tried to greet him. I thought it was odd, but Mom assured me that some people were just strange, and it was best to leave them to their own devices. But things started to feel a little off. Late at night, I would sometimes see a flashlight in the backyard of the house next door. It would move slowly across the yard, and I would watch curiously from my bedroom window. Then, on a couple of occasions, the light would stop moving, and suddenly it would shine right at my window. I quickly ducked down, holding my breath, and wondered how the man knew I was watching. But when I looked again, the light had disappeared, and there was no sign of him. Over time, I noticed even more strange things. The man didn't seem to go out during the day. I never saw him in the garden, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I told Mom about it, but she brushed it off, telling me not to worry and to focus on my own life. Then one afternoon, I was relaxing in the hot tub, gazing up at the clear blue sky. As I leaned back, I saw something moving along the fence next to the neighbor's yard. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a ladder leaning against the fence. At the top of the ladder stood the man, wearing a gas mask, peering over the fence and staring right at me. His eyes were obscured by the mask, but the way he was looking at me sent a chill down my spine. I froze, unsure of what to do. The man didn't speak, but he seemed to be studying me intently. Then, to my horror, he reached down and pulled a black cat from behind the fence. The cat was limp, either dead or unconscious. He held the cat in his hands for a moment, then pointed at me with his other hand and made a cutting motion across his throat. It was an unmistakable threat. Without a word, he climbed down from the ladder, took the ladder with him, and disappeared into his yard. My heart raced as I stood there, stunned. What was he doing? Why was he threatening me? And why was he holding a dead cat? I couldn't just ignore it. I needed to know what was going on, so I decided to do some investigating. I waited until dark, when both Mom and Dad were out for the weekend. Alone in the house, I grabbed a small flashlight and headed toward the fence that separated our yard from the neighbors. One of the fence panels was loose, something Dad had planned to fix. I slid through the gap and found myself in the man's backyard. It was eerily quiet, and the ground beneath my feet seemed soft and unsettled, as if something had been recently buried. As I moved closer to the shed at the back of his yard, I noticed a series of fresh mounds scattered around. My flashlight flickered as I crept forward, and soon I reached the door of the shed. It was unlocked, so I cautiously turned the handle and stepped inside. What I saw made my stomach turn. The shed was dark, musty, and reeked of something foul. On a large butcher's table in the center of the room was a wooden board covered in fresh blood. Bloodstains were splattered on the floor and walls. I could see a row of butcher knives hanging nearby, their edges stained with the same red liquid. As I shined my flashlight around the room, I froze. There were dead animals, cats, small dogs, hanging from meat hooks along the back wall. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that this man wasn't just strange, he was dangerous. But it got worse. On the back wall, I noticed strange symbols painted in red. At first, I thought it was just red paint, but when I looked closer, I realized it was blood. It wasn't just a random mess, it was intentional. The man was involved in some sort of dark ritual, sacrificing these poor animals as part of some twisted ritual. And to make matters worse, this man was our neighbor. I couldn't stay any longer. I quickly backed out of the shed, trying not to make a sound. Just as I was slipping out of the yard, I heard footsteps approaching. I scrambled to the gap in the fence, desperately trying to close it behind me without being noticed. Once I was safely back inside my house, I locked all the doors and grabbed my phone. I called 911, my hands shaking as I dialed the number. But just as I was about to speak, I saw him. The man from next door, holding a meat cleaver in his hand, was walking toward my front door. His movements were slow, deliberate. He was wearing all black, and his eyes seemed fixated on me. I didn't know what he planned to do, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. The operator answered, and I screamed into the phone, "There's someone with a weapon. He's breaking into the house." I quickly gave them our address, but by the time I finished, I heard the sound of the patio door smashing open. I bolted toward the front door, but the keys were in the kitchen. I had no time to grab them, so I ran out the back door and sprinted down the street. I looked back and saw the man standing in the doorway, still holding the cleaver. It felt like a nightmare. But then I saw flashing blue lights coming around the corner. The police car had arrived, and I flagged them down. They quickly entered the house, guns drawn. I explained everything to them as they rushed inside. After a few tense moments, I heard gunshots. The police had confronted the man. He had attacked one of the officers with the cleaver, and in self-defense, they had to shoot him. He died right there in front of our house. Later, the police found more than 40 animal graves in his backyard, along with strange ritual books and other evidence of his dark practices. It turned out the man had been living next to us for years, but nobody knew what he was really up to. It was a relief to know that he was no longer a threat, but the thought of what he had been doing so close to home left me shaken. I never expected to live next to someone so twisted, but sometimes the people you think you know are the ones who hide the darkest secrets. I had always considered myself a lucky man. For more than a decade, my wife Rachel and I lived what I thought was a perfect life. We had our ups and downs like any relationship, but in my eyes, we had it all. We lived in New York, the city that never sleeps, and we were thriving in our careers. But it all started in a much simpler way. Our story began in a work meeting where we first met, both working for the same company, although in different departments. It wasn't love at first sight, but something about her caught my attention. She was intelligent, confident, and had this air about her that was unlike anyone I had met before. After a few months of occasional chats and lunches, we started going out. We were both busy professionals, but we found time for each other. Over time, our relationship grew stronger, and we moved in together after a year of dating. That year, we were still figuring out the ins and outs of being in a relationship, but something felt right. We were growing, learning, and building something together. A year later, things began to get better in our careers. We both received promotions, which allowed us to earn more money. This, in turn, made it possible for us to buy a house, something that had always felt like a distant dream. We took on the responsibility of a mortgage, but we were ready. The house we bought was modest, but it had everything we needed. We started building our lives in this new home, filling it with memories and plans for the future. Another year passed, and we decided to get married. It was a small, intimate ceremony, but it was perfect. The vows we exchanged felt genuine, and I knew we were in it for the long haul. Things were going well, really well. We were happy, we were successful, and we were living life on our terms. 4 years into our marriage, we decided to move to a bigger house. We wanted more space, and we found a property with a pool and a large yard. It felt like we were stepping into the next phase of our life together. Everything seemed perfect, and yet, as we settled into our new home, we continued to talk about the one thing we had agreed on from the very beginning. We didn't want children. The idea of having kids just didn't fit into the life we were building. Our careers were important to both of us, and we feared that raising children would disrupt the balance we had worked so hard to create. We both loved our jet-setting lifestyle, flying to different countries for work and holidays, and we wanted to continue enjoying those experiences without the added responsibility of parenthood. But then something changed. One day, I found myself in Florida for a work conference, promoting products for a large company. It was a typical event, networking, meeting clients, and getting things done. But by the end of the third day, things took an unexpected turn. Some of the delegates began to feel unwell, and before long, even the main speakers were affected. It was strange. The whole event started to feel off, and the convention center manager made an announcement that the event would be canceled due to an illness spreading through the attendees. He mentioned something about a sickness bug going around and advised everyone to head home. I quickly gathered my team and advised them to return to the hotel, shower, and change their clothes. I instructed them to isolate once they got home, just to be safe. Fortunately, none of my team seemed to be affected, but I knew of several delegates who had fallen ill. One had even called a doctor because they were feeling so sick. After the announcement, I made sure everyone was on the next available flight back. I decided to head home the following morning. When I arrived back at the hotel, I showered and changed, then tried to call Rachel. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Odd, I thought. She never went this long without picking up. I called her office, and her assistant informed me that Rachel had taken the week off as a holiday. I was confused. She hadn't mentioned any vacation plans when I left for Florida. I didn't leave a message. Instead, I caught the next flight back to New York. I arrived home early in the morning, picked up my car from the airport parking lot, and headed back. As I turned onto our street, something caught my eye. There was a black Audi parked by our front door. Rachel's red Jag was parked on the other side. This was strange. We didn't know anyone with a black Audi. I parked my car and got out. As I walked inside, I noticed clothes scattered around the floor, some of them belonging to Rachel, others that didn't belong to me. My heart began to race. I rushed up the stairs and opened the door to our bedroom. The sight that greeted me was one I will never forget. Rachel was in bed with a man I didn't recognize. She screamed, and the man jumped out of bed, scrambling to grab his pants and apologizing profusely. My hands clenched into fists, and without thinking, I grabbed him by the neck and dragged him to the bedroom door. I threw him out, and he sped away in his car, tires screeching on the driveway. I stood there frozen. I turned to Rachel, asking her why. Why would she do this to us? To me? To everything we had built? She begged me, pleading for me to understand, but I was beyond reasoning. The trust that had once been the foundation of our relationship had shattered in an instant. We tried to salvage the marriage, but it was too late. 3 months later, we filed for divorce. We sold the house and split the proceeds. I left New York behind, severing all ties to the city, to Rachel, and to everything we had once built. I found a job in Virginia through some old connections, and I bought a smaller house. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a 3-bedroom home with a modest pool and yard, but it was mine. I made an offer on the house, and to my surprise, the seller accepted it right away. I had to get out of the hotel where I had been staying for weeks. The move happened quickly. By 3 p.m. on a Saturday, I was sitting in the middle of my new living room, surrounded by boxes. The house was quiet, the only sound being the distant rustling of leaves in the trees outside. I had a cup of coffee by the pool, but the water was green and needed cleaning. It was a shame because I had hoped to swim that evening, but the pool had to wait. I spent the night unpacking and getting settled. I had a microwave dinner and a couple of glasses of red wine. Exhausted, I dozed off on the couch only to be startled awake by a noise. At first I couldn't figure out what had woken me, but then I saw that the backyard security light had turned on. I got up and went to the window. The light illuminated the pool, and I noticed something strange. The water was rippling, almost as if someone or something was in it. I was confused, but I figured maybe an animal had wandered into the garden. I went outside to investigate, but as I got closer to the pool, I saw puddles of water by the edge. When I looked into the pool, the water had calmed down, moving only slightly in the night breeze. There were no animals around. It didn't make sense. The puddles, though, they were still there. They led a trail to the back of the yard, and then, just as suddenly, the trail disappeared. I turned back to head inside, but that's when I heard a scratching sound. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. I couldn't see where it was coming from, but then I realized it was coming from the well at the back of the property. I rushed over, trying to figure out what was happening. The cover of the well was nailed down, but the scratching continued. And then, I swear, I heard a faint voice saying, "Please." I tried to lift the cover, but it wouldn't budge. I ran to the garage, grabbed a crowbar, and came back. The scratching grew more intense, and when I finally pried the cover off, a terrible smell hit me. The stench was overwhelming. I turned away for a moment, but when I looked back, I saw the underside of the well cover had hundreds of deep scratches as if something or someone had been trapped down there. With the flashlight, I peered down into the well. It was deep, but my light caught something, an old teddy bear, some clothes, and something white in the water below. As I stood there, something brushed against my right side. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Then a small hand grabbed my left hand, and before I could react, it was gone. Feeling shaken, I called the police. By 10 a.m. the next morning, they had confirmed there were human remains in the well. They brought up the body of a young girl, no more than 11 years old. The police investigated and told me that the previous owners of the house had been foster parents. They had cared for a little girl for 2 years, but one night she disappeared. without a trace. The foster father had always believed she was taken, but the police never found any evidence to support that claim. 4 months after her disappearance, both foster parents were found dead from an overdose. The only clue was the little girl's skull, which had a crack on the left side. It seemed that something terrible had happened to her. The police told me that the well had been sealed during the investigation and they had never checked it. It wasn't until I found it that the mystery was solved. As for why I went to the well in the middle of the night, I couldn't explain it. I just had a strange feeling that something wasn't right. After that, nothing else strange happened in the house, but I could never shake the feeling that someone was still there, and I made sure to leave the well sealed. When I was very young, something terrifying happened that I'll never forget. It all started on a normal day when my parents were taking me on a road trip. We were driving across the countryside in our old, rugged truck. It was one of those days where everything seemed so peaceful, the sun shining brightly, the air fresh and warm. My parents were busy talking about their plans for the next few days, while I was happily staring out of the window, lost in my own little world. But little did I know, this seemingly ordinary day would take a turn into something horrific. My parents had a gun in the back of the truck, as they sometimes did for protection when they were traveling through unfamiliar or secluded areas. It wasn't anything unusual for them, but what happened next is something that still haunts me to this day. We had stopped by the side of the road for a quick break, and as my dad opened the truck to grab a snack, the unimaginable happened. The gun that had been carelessly placed in the back somehow went off. The loud bang that followed was deafening, and in a split second, everything changed. My mom screamed in pain, clutching her wrist, blood pouring from a wound. The bullet had gone right through her wrist, and with my heart racing, I looked down at my own foot. The same bullet had passed through my left foot as well, leaving me in agonizing pain. Everything was chaotic. My parents were panicked, trying to stop the bleeding, but I felt like I was in a nightmare. We were far from any hospital, and the pain was unbearable. My mom kept whispering comforting words, trying to calm me down, though I could see the fear in her eyes. We eventually managed to get help from a nearby farmhouse, and my mom and I were rushed to the nearest hospital. Fortunately, I still have my foot, but that day left a scar, not just on my body, but in my mind. It would be years before I could think about it without feeling that same dread. Fast forward 34 years to March of 2018. I had been battling a particularly nasty ear infection that kept me up for days on end. My head throbbed incessantly, and no matter what I did, I couldn't get any rest. My fiancé, Steve, who worked in construction, was in the habit of taking sleeping pills to get through his long, exhausting nights. On this particular Thursday night, I was finally feeling better, so I decided to get a deep sleep, hoping that the worst of my ear infection was over. The night seemed calm enough as we settled into bed. Steve was already deep in slumber due to his meds, and I was drifting off, finally feeling the sweet relief of rest. For the first time in days, I fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. But then I was abruptly woken by a sound that I couldn't quite place. At first I assumed it was Steve getting up for the bathroom, as it wasn't unusual for him to move around at odd hours. But the sound didn't stop. It was shouting, distant but unmistakable. My brain was still foggy from sleep, so I ignored it at first, thinking it was just a dream. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. It was Steve's voice, shouting. But why would he be shouting in the middle of the night? I sat up in bed, disoriented. As the yelling continued, it didn't make sense. In that half-dazed state, I thought maybe he was just having a bad dream or talking in his sleep. But then I understood the words he was shouting. "Give me the money!" he yelled. My heart raced. That was not something a dream would conjure. Those were the words of someone in danger, someone trying to fight off an intruder. Suddenly it hit me. The danger was real. Steve was yelling at someone, trying to protect us. My mind snapped into alert mode. But as I stumbled out of bed and into the dark hallway, I realized that something wasn't right. Steve was standing there, completely naked, facing two attackers who had somehow gotten into our home. He was blocking the door to our bedroom, trying to prevent them from getting to me. I froze, too scared to think clearly. The next few seconds felt like they stretched on forever. I heard the unmistakable sound of the door being slammed repeatedly, followed by the chaotic noise of someone struggling against the attackers. Then the gunshots. The harsh crack of gunfire echoed through the house, and my blood ran cold. Bullets were flying. I could hear the ricochet of metal and the thud of something heavy hitting the wall. It was pure panic. Steve was moving around the room with incredible speed, ducking and weaving like he was in a life-or-death battle. He was doing everything he could to keep the attackers at bay, slamming the door with all his might. And then I heard him yell again, "Get the gun! Get the gun!" In my state of shock, I didn't know what he meant at first. My mind was still struggling to comprehend what was happening. How was I supposed to react? I had just woken up, and my thoughts were a jumbled mess. But then it clicked. I remembered that we had a gun in the house. My heart pounded as I fumbled for the light switch and stumbled to the drawer where we kept it. I managed to grab the gun and handed it to Steve, praying that it would help him. But just as I did, I heard the sound of running footsteps and the door crashing open. The intruders had somehow managed to break in through the back door, and they were on their way out. The chaos, the shouting, and the violence had been too much for them to handle, and they had fled. Later, we learned that our not-so-smart roommate had forgotten to lock the back door. That one simple mistake had nearly cost us everything. I was shaking, my body trembling from the adrenaline and fear, but Steve was hurt. He had been grazed by 2 of the 6 bullets that had been shot at us. Thankfully, none of the shots had hit anything vital, but it still left him wounded. For the next month, I took care of Steve, helping him heal as best as I could. I kept him in bed, changing bandages, and giving him the medicine he needed to recover. It was an exhausting month, but I was just grateful he was alive. In the aftermath of the break-in, we got a dog for extra protection, and we installed a state-of-the-art home security system. We couldn't afford to take any chances again. But even with all the security measures in place, I still couldn't shake the fear. At night, I would sometimes place a chair under the doorknob just to give myself a small sense of security. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel like I was doing something. Despite everything, I haven't had a peaceful night's sleep since that terrifying night. Looking back on it, I often wonder how Steve managed to hear the intruders first. He had been heavily medicated, and yet he was the one who woke up and fought back. If he hadn't, I don't know what would have happened to me. I shudder to think of what those armed robbers might have done if Steve hadn't been there to protect me. Sometimes I can't help but feel like I'm cursed. It seems like the people who love me the most always end up taking the brunt of the danger. My mom, all those years ago, took a bullet for me, and now it was Steve. It scares me to think that anyone close to me has to face these terrifying situations because of me. To those two intruders who barged into our home that night, I have one thing to say. I hope karma finds you. What you did to us, to my family, will never be forgotten. And I can only hope you face the consequences for the fear and pain you caused. But in the end, I'm just grateful that Steve and I made it through that night. We survived, and we're stronger for it. Still, sometimes I wonder if that feeling of safety I once had will ever return. I guess only time will tell. When I was in second grade, my best friend Emily started telling me strange stories about her house. She would always seem uneasy, her voice dropping to a whisper when she shared what had been happening. At first, it was just small things. Objects disappearing, strange creaks in the floorboards late at night. But as time went on, her stories grew darker and more unsettling. One day, while playing hide-and-seek in her house, she showed me something that had been troubling her for weeks. In her basement, which was cold and dimly lit, there was a small hole forming in one of the brick walls. The walls down there were made of rough cinder blocks, and the hole was appearing in the mortar between them. It was tiny at first, no bigger than a coin, but Emily swore it hadn't been there before. By the time we were in 5th grade, the hole had grown noticeably larger. You could fit most of your arm into it, though it was still narrow. Emily and I had a curious streak, so we dared each other to reach inside. No matter how far we pushed our arms, we couldn't touch the back of the hole. It seemed to go on forever, like a tunnel. But that wasn't the strangest part. Emily swore she started hearing whispers coming from the hole at night. She said it sounded like people murmuring in a language she couldn't understand. I visited her house often, but I never heard the voices myself. Still, I could see how much it terrified her. Emily would barely sleep, her eyes always darting around like she was waiting for something terrible to happen. Emily's house itself was unsettling. Her family had a huge collection of pets. Dogs, cats, birds, rabbits, and even a few exotic animals like snakes and a parrot that mimicked voices perfectly. The basement was where they kept a lot of the animal supplies, and strangely enough, Emily's pets seemed to avoid it at all costs. Her dogs, usually playful and brave, would refuse to go down the stairs. The cats, on the rare occasions they ventured down, would freeze and stare at the hole in the wall, their fur bristling. Then the disappearances started. Emily's pets would vanish for hours, sometimes even days. When they were finally found, they would always be in the basement, sitting stiffly near the hole, staring at it as though in a trance. No one could explain it. Her parents brushed it off as animals being weird. But Emily and I both knew something wasn't right. One weekend, during a sleepover at her house, I started noticing more unsettling details. Emily's bedroom was filled with stuffed animals of all shapes and sizes. They were everywhere, on her bed, her bookshelves, even hanging from the ceiling in nets. That night, we stayed up late talking and watching movies. When we finally fell asleep, it was well past midnight. The next morning, we woke up to find every single stuffed animal had been moved. They were stacked in the middle of the room in a pyramid-like structure almost as tall as we were. Every stuffed animal was positioned to face her bed, their glassy eyes fixed on us. We were frozen in terror. Emily swore she hadn't done it, and I knew I hadn't either. The sheer effort it would have taken to pile them all up without waking us was mind-boggling. Some of the toys had been on high shelves or inside closed cabinets, and yet here they were, perfectly arranged. We put the animals back, trying to convince ourselves it was just some weird prank. But the next night, things escalated. Around 3 a.m, we were jolted awake by a loud creaking sound coming from under the bed. It sounded like the wooden floorboards were straining under someone's weight. Terrified but curious, we leaned over the edge of the bed and peered underneath. What we saw made my blood run cold. One of the floorboards was slowly lifting up, as though someone or something beneath the floor was pushing it. Then, with a loud snap, it slammed back into place. We bolted upright, too scared to move. Emily clung to me, tears streaming down her face. The room was silent, but the tension was suffocating. We stayed awake until the first light of dawn, clutching each other and staring at the floor, afraid of what might happen next. The following morning, I begged my parents to come and pick me up. I couldn't stay in that house another night. Emily begged me not to leave her alone, but I was too scared. I promised I'd see her at school and that we'd talk more about what was happening, but after that weekend, I started avoiding her. I felt guilty, but the fear was too much. Emily's life only seemed to get worse after that. At school, she became withdrawn and jittery, her grades slipping as her anxiety grew. Teachers noticed and tried to help, but her parents didn't seem to take her seriously. The last time I spoke to her was at the end of the school year. She told me the hole in the basement had grown so large that she could crawl inside it if she wanted to. She said she often heard noises coming from deep within it, scraping sounds, whispers, and occasionally faint laughter. Then she said something that still haunts me to this day. I think whatever's in the walls wants me to join it. After that, Emily and her family moved away. I never saw her again, but I couldn't stop thinking about her in that house. Over the years, I've pieced together my own theories about what might have been happening. I believe there was someone or something living within the walls of her house. Maybe it was a person, someone who had found a way to hide and move through the structure without being detected. Or maybe it was something not entirely human, something that thrived on fear. The stuffed animals, the disappearing pets, the whispers, everything seemed designed to unnerve us, to break us down mentally. It was like the house itself was alive, feeding off the fear it created. To this day, I can't walk past a stuffed animal display without feeling a chill. I still have nightmares about that hole in the wall, about what might have been lurking just beyond the edges of the darkness, waiting for us to notice it. And I still wonder what happened to Emily, and if she ever found peace, or if the thing in the walls finally got what it wanted. It was the summer of 2010, a time when I was just entering my teenage years. My family decided to take a trip to a city that was about 2 hours away from home. We stayed in a large, oddly designed hotel that had always intrigued me. Looking back, I never asked why we went there or why we stayed at that particular hotel. My parents had planned it, and as a kid, I just went along. Some family friends had also joined us on the trip, and they were staying in rooms close to ours. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. Little did I know that this trip would be anything but relaxing. Even at 12 years old, I was known for being a nervous kid. I startled easily, hated the dark, and always imagined monsters in the shadows. This wasn't unusual for me, and my family had learned to laugh off my overactive imagination. But what happened at that hotel wasn't just a product of my fears. Something very real occurred, something that I still think about to this day. The hotel itself was unusual. Its design made it feel like a maze. The lobby wasn't on the ground floor as you'd expect, but rather on the fourth. To reach it, you had to use an elevator. The staircases were strange, too. None of them seemed to connect directly to the lobby, which I found odd and mildly unsettling from the start. The hotel's floors formed a giant square, with a balcony overlooking the central lobby on every level. This meant that as you walked to your room, you could peer over the edge and see all the way down or up, depending on where you were. I remember clutching the railing and imagining what it would feel like to fall. It wasn't something I liked to think about for long. The first 2 days passed without much incident. My friends and I spent our time playing card games, watching TV, and exploring the brightly lit hallways of the hotel. At night, we told each other ghost stories, trying to outdo one another with tales of haunted houses and spooky woods. I was spooked easily, of course, but it was all in good fun, or so I thought. On the morning of the third day, everything changed. I was woken up by loud screaming. The sound echoed eerily through the open design of the hotel. For a moment, I thought it was part of a dream. But as I shook off my grogginess, I realized the screams were real. Curious and concerned, I stepped out onto the balcony and looked down. In the lobby below, a girl was lying on the floor surrounded by a mess of broken eggs and spilled milk. A small crowd had formed around her, and I could hear fragments of their conversations. "She fainted," one person said. "Call an ambulance," someone else shouted. The sight made my stomach churn. I spotted my family sitting at a table in the lobby, eating breakfast and watching the commotion unfold. I'd decided to head down to join them and find out what was going on. The elevator was on the opposite side of my floor, so I opted to take the stairs instead. It seemed like the faster option at the time. We were on the 7th or 8th floor, so I figured it wouldn't take long to get to the lobby. As I descended, I kept an eye out for the sign marking the 4th floor, but I didn't see it. I passed the 5th floor, then what I thought should be the 4th, but there was no door. I figured I must have missed it somehow, so I kept going. By the time I reached the bottom, I realized I had made a mistake. Instead of the lobby, I found myself in a dimly lit cinder block basement. The walls were cold and gray, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. There were no windows, and the fluorescent lights flickered ominously above me. In front of me stood a pair of heavy double doors. At first I hesitated. I didn't want to go back up the stairs, but I also wasn't sure I wanted to see what was behind those doors. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. I pushed them open and stepped inside. What I found was a massive, warehouse-like room. It was filled with stacks of furniture covered in plastic wrap, rows of tables, and what looked like old, forgotten hotel equipment. The space was eerily quiet, save for the hum of an unseen ventilation system. Dust floated in the beams of light that managed to sneak in from the cracks around the door. At the far end of the room, I spotted an elevator. Relieved, I started walking toward it, hoping it would take me back to the lobby. But when I reached it, I noticed it required a key card to operate. Frustrated, I turned back toward the double doors, only to find they had locked behind me. Panic set in. I didn't have a phone, and my parents probably thought I was still in my room. No one knew where I was. I started searching the room for another way out. I opened cabinets, checked behind stacks of boxes, and even peeked under the plastic-wrapped furniture. But there was nothing. No doors, no windows, no escape. Just as I was about to give up, I heard the faint creak of a door opening behind me. I spun around and saw a man stepping through one of the side doors. He was tall and thin, with graying hair and glasses. What struck me as odd was his outfit. He was wearing a lab coat. "What are you doing down here?" he asked, his voice calm but slightly strained. I got lost," I stammered. "Do you have a key to the door?" He didn't answer my question. Instead, he said, "Follow me. I know a way out." Relieved, I started to follow him. But as we walked, something about him felt off. He kept glancing over his shoulder at me, and his pace was slow and deliberate, as if he was stalling. We passed the stairwell door I had come through earlier, but instead of stopping, he led me deeper into the basement. The air grew colder, and the lighting became dimmer. I started to feel uneasy. "Where are we going?" I asked. "This way," he replied curtly. Ahead of us was a row of tall metal shelves stacked with boxes. Beyond them, I could see that the room ended in a blank concrete wall. There was no way out. I stopped walking. "There's nothing over there," I said. The man turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Just follow me," he insisted. At that moment, every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. I took a step back and yelled as loud as I could. The sound echoed through the room, startling the man. "What are you doing?" he snapped. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and bolted toward the stairwell door. Behind me, I could hear him shouting, but I didn't look back. My heart was pounding in my chest as I reached the door and yanked on the handle. To my relief, it opened. Standing on the other side was a janitor, his expression one of surprise and concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. Before I could answer, the man in the lab coat appeared behind me. He started explaining that he was just trying to help me, but the janitor didn't seem convinced. "Let's get you upstairs," the janitor said, ignoring the man. He led me back up to the lobby, where I found my family. I burst into tears as I told them what had happened. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what he was doing in the basement. All I know is that I was lucky to get out. My parents' house sits next to a peculiar little red house, one that had always intrigued me for reasons I couldn't quite articulate. Its backyard faces ours, and from our porch I could see the side of the house with a weathered wooden deck and two large windows that seemed to gaze out like vacant eyes. The house was far from abandoned. There were always at least 3 cars parked in the driveway or along the curb. Yet, in all the years we lived there, no one seemed to use them. Not once did I see anyone stepping out to check the mail, take out the trash, or even enjoy the deck on a sunny day. It was as if the house existed in a bubble, completely detached from the world around it. Even the neighbors avoided mentioning it, like some unspoken agreement hung over our quiet street. I was 12 the first time something caught my attention. It was late in the evening, the kind of night where the air feels heavy and still. I was playing in the backyard when, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed faint shadows moving on the far wall of the red house through one of the windows. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no. There were definitely shape-shifting, like silhouettes of people walking. I froze, transfixed. It was the first time I'd ever seen any sign of life in that house. Over the years, I tried not to think about it too much. Life carried on, and soon my sister moved out, leaving me her basement room. It was a cozy space that had been renovated with care. The room had a door leading directly to the backyard with a small window set into it. My sister had covered the window with a poster of Pulp Fiction to block out the view, but I preferred something lighter and more open. I replaced it with sheer curtains that let in just enough light to feel connected to the outside without exposing too much. The room quickly became my sanctuary. From my bed or the couch, I had a clear view of the door. At night, I would sometimes hear the faint crunch of leaves in the outdoor stairwell leading down to the door. At first, I assumed it was our cat prowling around, but as the weeks went on, I started to feel uneasy. The sounds seemed too deliberate, too heavy for a cat. One night, my boyfriend was over while my parents were working late. We were sitting on the couch talking and laughing when he suddenly went silent. His eyes were fixed on the small window in the door, his face pale. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "See what?" I asked, already feeling a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. "A camera flash," he said, his voice barely audible. I tried to laugh it off, telling him he must have imagined it. But as the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the creeping unease that clung to me. When it came time to sleep, I kept glancing at the gap between the curtains, my heart racing every time I thought I saw movement in the shadows. The stairwell outside was pitch dark. There was no light installed there, so even if someone were standing at the bottom of the stairs, I wouldn't have been able to see them clearly. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of leaves crunching underfoot. This time, the steps were heavy, deliberate. My blood ran cold. I should have stayed in bed, locked the door, and called someone for help. But for reasons I still can't explain, I decided to confront whoever or whatever was out there. Barefoot and trembling, I flung the door open. The cool night air hit me, and I immediately scanned the stairwell. It was empty. I hesitated for a moment before stepping outside and climbing the stairs to the backyard. That's when I saw him. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, stood near the edge of our yard, partially hidden by the shadows of the trees. He wore a grimy mechanic's jumpsuit, and in his hands he held an old digital camera, the kind that looked like it hadn't been used in a decade. His face was partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unblinking. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. We just stared at each other, frozen in a bizarre, silent standoff. The longer I looked at him, the more a sickening dread settled in my stomach. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he stood there, like he belonged in the shadows, watching. Finally, I found my voice and shouted, "Hey, what are you doing?" My words seemed to snap him out of whatever trance he was in. Without a word, he turned and bolted toward the red house, disappearing into the darkness like a phantom. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. It wasn't until the sound of his footsteps faded completely that I managed to move, stumbling back into the house and locking the door behind me. The next morning, I told my parents everything. They were understandably alarmed, but tried to reassure me it was probably just some vagrant passing through. But I knew better. The way that man had looked at me, the way he had stood there as if he had every right to be watching. It wasn't the first time he'd been there, and it wouldn't have been the last if I hadn't confronted him. After that night, the sounds stopped. No more crunching leaves, no more flashes of light. The red house remained as lifeless as ever, its secrets locked away behind those blank, staring windows. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, carrying the faint scent of decaying leaves and damp earth, I can't help but wonder, how many nights had he been there, standing silently in the shadows, watching me through the glass?